Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan.
It's hard enough to believe that someone as small as Danny DeVito is the same species as someone as large as Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's even harder to believe that they're twins, as revealed in their biopic, Twins. But that's just the diversity we see amongst the human species. In the Star Wars galaxy, there are thousands of different sentient species with completely different appearances and physical attributes. Today we'll be taking a look at some of the physically strongest alien species in the entire galaxy. Many of these guys can rip a human being in half with their bare hands. The average Wookiee was around 78 feet tall and weighed around 330 pounds. At the extreme, some Wookiees could grow up to 10 feet tall. Now, some of the tallest human NBA basketball players in the world would only be considered medium or small size for a Wookiee. Yao Ming, for instance, was 7'6" and 311 pounds. 300 pounds is a lot of weight. The average offensive lineman in the NFL usually weighs around this much. But when you're as tall as Yao, 300 pounds doesn't actually look like that much. Yao Ming wasn't considered overweight or heavy, but his sheer physical size was pushing the maximum limits of what the human bone structure and musculature could handle, and so he was very injury prone as a result of his height. I mean, humans are really weak. Even compared to other simians like gorillas or even chimps, our bone and muscle density is much lower. Now, Wookiees, on the other hand, are made completely different. They're around the size of Yao Ming, and they do lumber around quite slowly. But they're also able to swing from tree to tree and jump from great heights and survive. This is because their bone structure and muscles are extremely dense. They're just much more durable than human beings and are a whole lot stronger. When angered, a large Wookiee could even rip the arms off of another humanoid, which is quite impressive to see. Believe it or not, in its home environment on the planet of Kashyyyk, Wookiees survived not because of their physical abilities, but because of their intelligence. Their world was covered in massive forests with trees that grew miles into the canopy. The underforest was dark and deadly. It was a place full of monsters, insects, and other things that would love to eat a Wookiee. Perhaps the extreme nature of Kashyyyk is why the Wookiees evolved to be so durable in the first place. Wookiees also had extremely long life cycles. They could live up to 400 years long. This meant that they had a much longer time to maintain and develop new muscles. When it comes to powerlifting, for instance, it can take a human athlete well into their 30s to reach their peak power. Wookiees have a much longer lifespan, and so they technically should have a much longer period of peak physical ability where they can train their body to become stronger and stronger. Also, Wookiees have to consume around 3,500 to 6,000 calories a day in order to sustain their size, which is a lot of pork meat. The Talz were large, white-furred creatures that lived in frozen Arctic environments. They had a relatively short lifespan of 52 years and had an average height of 7 feet tall and weighed around 200 pounds. This makes them quite light for their size, but don't sleep on how terrifying these creatures could be. Their hands had large claws and talons which could do an immense amount of damage. They were also strong enough to throw giant spears like a human could throw javelins. Luckily, during the Imperial era, the Talz had developed into a very peaceful and kind society. The Talz didn't even believe in the concept of ownership, which meant that they could just borrow things from one another. This, of course, caused issues when the Talz were introduced to the wider galactic society. Wookiees and Talz might seem tough, but Hutts are actually in a league of their own. Now, when you think Hutts, you usually think Jabba, who is grossly overweight and generally a lazy gangster who smoked too much spice and killed way too much of his dancers for fun. But beneath this many layers of fat, Jabba was still a Hutt, and they were widely considered one of the most dangerous alien species in the entire galaxy. Like the Wookiees, the Hutts evolved on a very dangerous planet full of apex predators. Like the Wookiees, the Hutts were also at the bottom of the food chain and had to rely on their intelligence to survive. Also, like the Wookiees, the Hutts could survive for a really long time. But for the first 50 years of their life, they were completely useless and usually lived inside of a sack inside of their mother/father. Hutts were sort of like these asexual marsupials. They had the little sacks and they could change sex in order to become pregnant. Once they reached the age of 200, Hutts were considered adults and usually weighed around 500 kilos or 1,100 pounds. After that, their growth would just continue endlessly until they died. Most Hutts could live up to 1,000 years, if they didn't get murdered first, that is. And so some Hutts, especially the really old ones, were beyond enormous and could no longer move and usually relied on repulsor lifts to get around. Assassination attempts against Hutts were very common, but rarely succeeded. When Princess Leia killed Jabba, she was labeled as the Hutt killer and almost worshipped for her combat abilities by the Nikto, a species that were enslaved by the Hutts. Believe it or not, when the Hutts were young and in their early adults, they were quite mobile and they can walk around pretty fast, or I guess slither around on their slug-like bodies. In physical combat, their tail could be used as a bludgeon and it could easily cave in the skull of a human being. Hutts had no skeleton or bones, but they had thick muscles running all throughout their body. And their skin was extremely tough as well. It could deflect some projectiles and melee weapons, and the slime on their body could even neutralize corrosive chemicals and toxins. If you managed to break through their skin, the Hutts also had redundant organs, including 3 lungs, which allowed them to hold their breath for an extremely long period of time. If that wasn't crazy enough, the Hutts could even regenerate every part of their body after a gruesome injury. One Hutt even was able to regrow their brain and eye after getting attacked by a Wanderella. With an average height of around 7 feet, the Hook were considered one of the physically strongest alien species in the entire galaxy, and oftentimes compared to the Wookiees. Their large bodies were covered in muscle and thick skin, and it was said that their species had some of the densest skulls in the entire galaxy. Oddly enough, the Hook liked to sneak around and attack people while they weren't looking. They were very stealth-oriented. Trandoshans have a very special relationship with Wookiees. They've basically been hunting and enslaving them since the beginning of time. It's actually a part of their religion, so it's okay. But in order to hunt Wookiees, one must also be physically quite impressive, and the Trandoshans definitely were. With an average height of around 6.9 feet, the Trandoshans are smaller and lighter than a Wookiee, but they were usually quite lanky and had very sharp claws. If they lost a limb or skin, they could usually also regenerate it unless they were old and sick. The average Trandoshan usually couldn't defeat the average Wookiee in unarmed combat, but the fact that they still try means that they deserve to at least have a spot on this list. Besalisks were burly aliens whose average height ranged from 6'1" to 7.7 feet. But what made them so formidable was their multiple arms. Males usually had 4, and females could grow up to 8 arms. These additional arms meant that the Besalisks required a lot of nutrition and food to keep up with their intense metabolism. But having multiple arms meant that they could throw a flurry of punches or wield multiple weapons and easily overwhelm anyone they're fighting as well. Jedi Master Pong Krell was a sight to behold on the battlefield. He would dual-wield 2 double-ended lightsabers and turned into a whirlwind of destruction whenever he wanted to. The Neti were a sentient plant shape-shifting species. Their size could range from just 6 feet to well over 30 feet depending on what form they decide to take. Their skin was gray and tough like plant bark. They also had multiple thin branching arms coming from their thick trunk-like body. In combat, they could swing their heavy limbs or even wrap up enemies in their branches and vines. Other than their weakness to fire, the Neti were very formidable fighters, and they were able to power all of this through photosynthesis. Next up, we have the legendary Gendai, who were so powerful that they apparently can't even exist in the current canon. These creatures can live up to 4,000 to 7,000 years. They had no bones and were completely formless and usually wore heavy armor to give themselves structure. Even though they lacked bones, their bodies were basically a mass of muscle and nerves and were extremely powerful and could shift into different shapes and do a lot of physical damage. Killing a Gendai was extremely hard to do because of their amazing regenerative properties. They lacked vital organs that could be targeted like hearts and lungs. While some species on our list could slowly regenerate their limbs, the Gendai could do it almost instantaneously. The only real way to destroy the Gendai was to incinerate or destroy their brain. So there you have it, guys. 8 species that are a lot physically stronger than human beings. You should never tackle any of these aliens in hand-to-hand combat. Always use weapons and only shoot first. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.